is long runs. Every week I do a 20 to 25 mile long run. We don't hammer these long runs like other, like we're seeing in training plans more prominently these days. Our long runs are mostly about getting time in on my feet. Sometimes we'll include a few miles of tempo, marathon pace tempo in those. But really, then we have our marathon pace tempos that don't go longer than 13-ish miles, and long intervals and track work. And we still spend at least every other week, we're doing some sort of VO2 max kind of effort workout on the track. We're doing fast intervals, and it's the old school training, but it's what's been working for me.
Mike, the training that Jared just described sounds old and boring. Shouldn't marathoners be experimenting with something new?
Amby, I think Jared just nailed it on the head. And if you look at what he just described, if you read what Frank Shorter and Bill Rogers did, if you read what Eliud Kipchoge is doing, you see a pattern emerging. People are running around, 100 to 140 miles a week, depending on the week. There's a long run. There are a lot of 8, 10, 12-mile runs where somebody's pushing it a little bit at the end, and people are doing some pretty hardcore interval training. We were talking before, in some ways, people are training for the 5,000 and just adding mileage. And when you've trained for the 5,000, that's the way you get your VO2 max as high as it's going to possibly go. And then all of the other stuff helps your lactate threshold and running economy. And as you know, my description is quite simple. People have said, Dr. Joyner, you need to write a book about running. And I say, I have. It's called The Running Haiku. Run a lot of miles, some faster than your race pace, rest once in a while. And for people keeping score at home, that's 575.
That's, Jared, you brought up something which is a little bit of a bias of mine, so I want to dig into it now. You talked about the fact that you don't hammer your long runs and you don't try and beat whatever tempo run somebody else did on the internet last week. Because tempo runs are sub-maximal, which means you can keep them going for a while, there's this tendency out there, I believe, for people to go tempo runs forever and ever and ever and think that they're accomplishing something. How do you find the right balance there?
Well, Coach Eystone will say, if you want a race, let's sign up for a race, and we'll taper you for it, and we'll get you ready for it. And if you want training, let's do training. And the inverse goes as well. He says, well, we don't fly 2,000 miles for a training effort. We can do that at home. So when we fly, we race. And I think, that's a balance, and it's a tricky mind game in a social world where everyone can see what everyone else is doing. You can tend to get competitive before the race even starts. But I feel like my philosophy on marathon training has evolved as I've aged to reflecting more of this idea that marathon training is about conditioning your body to adapt to change. We're trying to create change, and we're trying to adapt to it. And so if we go out and race every single week, then we're causing change, we're breaking down, but we might not be adapting to it. And I think a better gauge of how good marathon training is going is how quickly are you recovering from the runs that you do, maybe more than how fast or how long are you going on those runs.
So Mike, in marathon training, everybody, beginner, intermediate, Jared Ward, starts out with a long run at distance X and then adds a mile or two and adds another mile or two and adds another mile or two. But is there a danger to do the same thing with your tempo runs and running them 10 miles and then 12 and 14, 16, and et cetera?
Right, Amby. And one of the things I like about tempo runs is back in 1977, I was a subject in the original lactate threshold paper, and the lactate threshold became tempo runs. And as Mike Bergman will tell you, we used to, with Dave Murray at the University of Arizona, do things called control runs. Same idea. But I think there is a risk of doing that, and there's always a risk of doing more. There's always a risk of an arms race mentality. That used to be tempered because people were more isolated, and you had no idea what anybody else was doing unless you either talked to them personally, read it in Runner's World, or saw it in Track and Field News. You're right now, you can get people's data off Strava. Somebody can tweet that they did X, Y, or Z, post it on Facebook, whatever. But I have a question for you, Jared. When you go out in a group and are doing a generic 10-mile run around Provo, so you start off, you walk, you jog, and you get going, how often are people not really blasting away at the end, but how often do you pick it up the second half of the run?
It's an interesting question, and frankly, I've done a lot more of my easy runs by myself in later years just for that reason. I want to be able to progress in the run as I feel, and I also want to feel the liberty of going the pace that I want to towards the end of the run, and that's, I think that I felt a lot less pressure in marathon training over this idea that it kind of ebbs and flows. And I think if we show up for an interval workout as a group, maybe I run it in the group and I feel okay. Well, the next day on my recovery run, if you want to call it, I'm already feeling fairly recovered. I can push or let that pace creep down over the final miles of that run. And so I feel like those recovery runs to me have become this balancing run where it can be as slow or as fast as my body feels it's ready for, given the bulk and wealth of training. And I very much run those by feel.
So, Jared, I wasn't even going to ask you about recovery. It's not on my list, but it is a key subject, and you brought it up, and everybody knows how important it is. And there are a world of recovery modalities out there now. A friend of mine has written a book on recovery, Good to Go, by Christy Ashwandon, and she kind of dissed most of the recovery stuff that's out there. You can get needles poked in you can get ice, you can get massage, you can hang upside down, and that's only a third of the things you can do. What works for you? What do you have faith in?
Well, I got to be a little careful here. My wife's a massage therapist, and I own part of a company that makes vibrating heating massage balls. So,
do they work?
Let's try to balance this. Yeah, yeah, I think again, part of recovery is causing some sort of change, and I feel like the really balanced sports therapists and things like that will say, hey, maybe we don't know exactly what's going on here, but sticking some dry needles in there is going to cause some change, and then that, if that's the spark that lights the body's fire to go and heal something, then that's what's going on. And I really, I don't understand a lot of the science, and there's increasing studies on what causes blood flow, and we can measure through some different things if we're getting additional blood flow and things like that, but really, we don't know, and so it's about feel. And I think vibration feels good to me, and I feel better after I sit on something that's vibrating or use something that's vibrating on me to get my muscle kind of warmed up and going. And so I do it. And I had hamstring pulls in 2018, a series of them, and dry needling seemed to make it feel better. And so to me, that's kind of been my gauge as well. I'm going to try something, I'm going to see how it feels, and then I'm going to go with it.
Mike, back in the days, you're kind of prehistoric like me. We used to try and flush out lactic acid. We didn't know what that meant or whatever. And of course, now we know it doesn't work like that. What recovery mechanisms do you think are good? And what do you think about Jared's feedback loop, which is if it feels good, probably is good?
So I think a couple things, Ambi. The lactate story is, of course, a lot of fun. People need to recognize that with 20 or 30 minutes of jogging after a maximum effort, all the lactic acid in your blood is gone. So people recover very quickly from that, and lactate is not what makes you sore. What makes people sore is small amounts of skeletal muscle and tendon and ligament breakdown, and that's why you get sore, for example, when you run downhill. And you typically get sore 24 hours after, but it really peaks 48 or 72 hours after. So I think what Jared described is not atypical. A lot of people have things that they like to do. The evidence base we would think about medically, has there been a randomized clinical trial showing this works, is minimal for many of these things. And to actually ever do one, you would take thousands of people or hundreds of people and randomize them to trial A versus B and so forth. But I think you're right. If it feels good, breaks up your routine and so forth, and there's no risk of injury, why not? And I think the other thing too that's really important about recovery is a mental recovery, a mental break. And I think one of the things that was a little bit better in the prehistoric era, paradoxically, was people had jobs or they were going to school, so you just couldn't think about it all the time. And I think you do something other than just run as well. So I think if you spend all day thinking about running, it can really get to be a psychological grind. And I would encourage people to do something other than just run full time.
Yeah, Jared has 4 children, more? 4 children, and is a statistics professor. I don't know if that's full-time at BYU, but he's certainly teaching classes and leading the complete and balanced life. Also today, you're looking, to my eye, very lean and mean. So I wanted to ask you about the concept of train high, race low, which is the notion that during your big training weeks, you can have a couple extra pounds on your body, but on race day, you'd like to be down to a pretty fine line. Do you try to do that? And if so, how do you balance it?
Good. So on Live High, Train Low, we have done that. I don't like to leave and train without my family. I feel like there's something to this balance principle that even in the middle of training, it's nice to have things to worry about besides training. And you can only run so many hours a day. And so I go with my family, and as we've gotten more kids and my kids have gotten older, that just becomes a little bit logistically tougher. And we considered doing it this winter, but last year for the New York Marathon and the Boston Marathon both, we just stayed home at 4,500 feet instead of moving 3,000 feet higher somewhere to train, and they went well. And so I think there's a trade-off probably in terms of going and getting the benefit that science says is there and keeping things normal. And it's kind of interesting that the world gets we kind of get really excited about things, research, and then as we continue to research it, we tend to realize that the truth is probably somewhere in the middle in terms of benefits. And as we continue to explore altitude training, some people are responders to altitude training. Some people are kind of more like non-responders. And to some people, it has a big benefit, and others it's more minimal. And so there's a whole range of benefits to gain there. And so I don't do blood work and stuff. I haven't had anything in my blood tested since I was injured at the Olympic Training Center 2.5 years ago. So it's all based on how I feel. And while I buy into the science, I really put weight into anecdotally how I feel. So we stayed home. As it relates to race weight, that was something that I used to think a lot about, and getting myself down to race weight towards the end of a build was important. And then I listened to a podcast by Ryan Hall that he did, and he said his best marathons were when he was 10 pounds heavier from his lightest. And I thought, maybe there's something here to just feeling good. And so the Boston Marathon last year, I experimented with just going into it, eating normal, feeling good going in. I mean, I carb loaded and I did a little bit of a carb cycle, but I didn't cut down to race weight. And so I raced 6-8 pounds heavier than I did in the Rio Olympics, and I ran well and I felt good. And I think and also it meant that when I came off the training cycle, I wasn't so much onto this, okay, I've been in this extreme, so I have to bounce back to this extreme, and I go on a see it, eat it diet for about 3 weeks, and then I have to start working back to this extreme to get back to training weight, and found that I was bouncing back and forth. And if I just found something that was healthy and sustainable and comfortable day in, day out, that it worked a little bit better for me.
Thank you. Jared's a depressingly balanced guy, isn't he? You don't deserve any of your marathon success, I'm sure. Mike, you were born at 4,500 or so. A lot of the world's best marathoners were born at 7,000 feet in East Africa. Do you have to be born and grow up at altitude to run a really fast marathon?
No.
Be careful. I have a race in 2 days.
No,
Yeah.
Andy, I don't.
No East Africans.
I don't think so. I think if you look at the East Africans, it's very complicated. There are a number of factors which could explain things. And a couple of thoughts about that. The one chronic adaptation that occurs in people that have been born at high altitude is they have larger lungs and the surface area of their lungs is greater. That was shown by a man named Jerry Dempsey, who's in his 80s now, professor for many years at the University of Wisconsin. And they showed this in people who had been born in Leadville, Colorado. So these were Caucasians, and that's been backed up by animals. So in general, in the marathon is still submaximal. Lung volume, surface area is probably not going to be a determining factor. So the short answer is I don't think so. I think when you do think about being born at altitude, and Jared living in Utah may see some of this. I grew up in Arizona, and one of the more amazing individuals I ever saw or met was a Taos Pueblo Indian named Al Waukees, who won the Pikes Peak Marathon many times. I think he may still hold the record for the ascent up the Empire State Building. But we used to go to Albuquerque and run up the La Luz Trail. And people like Rick Rojas, whose daughter is in the race on Saturday, Rick was running 28 minutes for 10K and was the top U.S. 10K runner. And Al Waukees would beat the pros from Boulder by a couple of minutes up the trails of north of Albuquerque. And he just didn't have a lot of interest in ever really running a flat run. If you look at the Four Corners region, you look at the high school results from Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and parts of Utah, there are some tremendously fast kids from that area. And again, very few have gone on to run in college. And I think there's a big talent pool there. There's probably a big talent pool in South America. There's a number of good Colombian bike riders, and probably someplace over in the Himalayas as well. So I think anybody who's interested in talent ID, talk to me, and we can set up a program in other high altitude places.
Great, thank you. Jared, taper is crucially important before a marathon. What's the point of breaking your back for 12 or 16 weeks unless you're going to get the taper right and be right on race day? This is one of the areas when I read the science, I feel as if the science is asking athletes to cut back more than the athletes really do in practice for either neurotic or perhaps because they're smarter than the scientists. I'm not sure. What's your thinking on taper? How long do you taper and what percent? All those little things.
Well, that's validating to hear you say, because we tend to follow what the science says, and it seems like an extreme taper. So I'm going to say that everyone who does it different is neurotic. Yes. No, but that just means that I'm neurotic as well, because I appreciate the validation. I think that there's a couple of things, and we've talked before about the mental aspect of running and how that is changing. And I think coaches are trying to, good coaches are looking at the science and balancing what they need to do to cradle this sensitive athlete mind and get them to the start line. And so I think probably what we're seeing is some sort of balance between those two things. And you don't want to be on the start line believing that you've lost all of your fitness, but yet you want to kind of follow the science. And I remember talking with the Hansons and their coaching philosophy, and we're talking about good athletes that they'd had, and some of them would just say, I need to run 8 miles at a pretty good pace the day before the race. And that's just what they needed to feel good. And so the coaches would kind of take a step back and say, okay, if that's what's going to take to get your mind right, then we'll let you do it. But I ran 25 miles 3 weeks ago. That was my last long run. And again, it's not a kind of a grinder run. It's more of just getting in the volume. And my last long tempo would have been before that. And we had a shorter tempo last week. An 8 mile tempo last week. But those runs took place a ways back. We did a VO2 session towards the end of last week. And but my volume probably 3 weeks out goes 90%, and 2 weeks out 60%, and the week of up to the race 30%. And so it's a pretty significant taper.
Based on science of the taper, I'm putting all my money on Jared Saturday morning. Mike, thoughts on taper, and why do athletes think they need to keep running 80 miles a week, the Olympians?
Three thoughts. One is, if you ever want to really see something crazy, go to Hawaii and watch the Ironman, and you'll see people out on their bikes the day before the race, 20 or 30 miles from where they're staying. You're thinking, what is going on here? I think this 90, 60, 30 is interesting, because when I give people informal advice, I tell them 80, 60, 40. So it's same kind of thing. Ambi, it's very individualized. I think what Jared describes is certainly consistent with the science and makes a lot of sense. I think there are other people that do their normal training and run 3 miles a day the 3 days before the race. And there's been some very successful people who do it that way. What did you used to do?
Oh, I didn't like tapering either. I mean, all of us get that queasy feeling, I think, during taper. And I think a lot of the more neurotic runners think they got to keep on doing 10 miles a day or whatever. And then you look at the science, and it says, do like Jared. So I sometimes wonder if people don't leave their best races in their training rather than on race day. And this is a very bad event to not be peaked for. I got to tell any of you who are running, I hope you've been following Jared's principles.
So, you know, Ambi, the other thing is sometimes I think in running, because it's such a elemental sport, people don't maybe learn as much as they could from other sports. And the swimmers who do huge yardage for 2-minute events, which is a separate issue, and do intervals every day, twice a day, the swimmers are fanatical tapers, describing what you do. Oh, yeah, they cut way back. And they'll be swimming super high volume, and then 3 weeks before the big meets, they'll cut back.
Because I guess I would have assumed that in a lower impact sport that less taper would be required. That's not the case. Huh?
No, because they're sitting there training 4 hours a day.
Yeah, a lot of training. They've got more to taper from.
And that's the problem is, and same with cycling, because you don't have the impact. You're not sore. You're not pulling hamstrings, so their arms and legs may feel like wood. They're not having the kind of mechanical injuries you get running, stress fractures, stuff like that. And then they taper, and then they feel like somebody put their hand in the light socket. You can see it happen. They start riding higher on the water. They put faster suits on, and it's like it's crazy to watch.
So I'm going to pick things up here now because we've got a few more important topics to cover. I've got written down fueling, ergogenics, pacing, hills, and the mind, if any of us know anything about the mind. So, Jared, when Michael and I were young pups, there was an absolute pre-race routine, 7 days out, 20-miler, maybe pretty hard. Next 4 days, all you ate was protein and fat. And then you did a complete switch, and all you ate was carbohydrates for 3 days. I hope you're doing the same.
It's a little, I do a little less extreme. And, and I've read some research that seems to indicate that a tempered version of the old-fashioned carb cycling seems to produce as good of results and in some cases better results than a real extreme one. And man, I remember asking Coach Eyestone once what he did, and he said, yeah, I tried an extreme carb cycle once, and I hated how I felt 4 days out. I was so worried that I couldn't even run that I never did it again. And so mine's a tempered version of that. 7 days out, I ran a 12-mile run. And then, I shift, I probably eat 3,500 to 4,000 calories a day. I'm running roughly 20 miles a day or 15 to 20 miles a day. And as I get into the week before the race, for the first 3 to 4 days, I cut out half the fats and proteins, and that probably reduces my caloric intake by about 25%. And then 3 or 4 days before the race, I switch and add the carbs. I cut the carbs. So 7 days out, I cut half the fats and proteins, and then 3 or 4 days out. Sorry, I'm backwards. I cut half the. You get what I'm saying. I cut the carbs first, and then I add them back in and cut the fats and proteins in half.
Yeah, and I think the science on that is pretty strong these days.
Yeah,
you don't have to go through the crazy
stuff.
stuff.
You don't have to, especially if you were doing lower mileage, and we're doing this in the lab. The depletion works, but you don't have to do it if you're doing higher mileage or higher volumes. And that's been validated with skeletal muscle biopsy studies, among other things, many times.
So what fueling will you do on course on Saturday? Fluids, gels, whatever. And how will it change versus, it's going to be a cool day apparently, how will it be different versus if it had been 70 degrees?
Well, you go back to a marathon like the marathon trials in LA were, and it was 80 degrees and sunny at noon, with limited water on the course. I finished that race 15 pounds lighter than I started it. So in conditions like that, the concern is hydration. I mean, nutritional sugar and stuff is on the back burner too. How much water could I offset the loss of? And I found that's really was the limiting factor. In good conditions like this, it's about getting the sugar in. And this is where I'm going to go a little off of conventional science, at least. And I'll be drinking Martin during the race, which is a higher percentage carbohydrate solution than science might say. And Martin has some certainly anecdotal conversations, but a little bit of research or a little bit of theory, I guess, to why maybe that works. There's supposed to be some gelling in the stomach, and it's supposed to release over a longer period of time. But in a race like this, I'm looking for something that settles, and I really don't care how much hydration I'm getting in. I'm just using hydration as a vehicle for the calories. And drinking Martin has a lot of calories in it. I'll have some honey stinger gels taped to my bottle that's just honey gels that I'll use should I feel that, or drink if I feel like the Martin. But it's just going to be about getting as much sugar as I can in me with my stomach still feeling like it's underneath me.
And are you going to try and hit it from the first availability on the course, or are you going to go by how you're feeling?
No, I like to be a little preemptive. And so I anticipate that over the first half of this race, it's going to be a little more conservative than over the second half. And so I feel like if I can get to 13 miles and have already refueled to offset some of the loss, then maybe that puts me in a better position to not have to fuel when my stomach doesn't feel like it at mile 22.
Mike?
No, I think your strategy's right on, and I think some of these newer compounds may permit people to get more carbohydrate out of their GI system and into their blood. Typically, the magic number was about 1 gram per minute, or about 60 grams per hour, but there's some evidence with either glucose, fructose mixes, or some polykos or longer chains, you might be able to do better than that. And I think the other reason to do it, in addition to just concerns about fueling and or hydration, is that the more carbohydrate you burn, the more efficient you are, or the better your running economy is potentially. And you really actually want to burn carbohydrate to the extent you can as opposed to fat, because it will make you slightly more efficient.
Jared, there's a limited number of things out there that are thought to be ergogenics for distance runners and are totally legal. They include caffeine. People are into beets and nitrate now, and menthol has come up in the last year or two, especially for hot weather. Either for yourself, what works, or what do you think the larger marathon community around you is doing with regard to these things these days? Has beetroot caught on?
I think it has, and a few of these things have caught on. And for me, I guess I've been listening to Alex Hutchinson's Endure, where he compiles a lot of this research on maybe what the limiting factors of endurance are. And he talks about some of these things. He talks about taking Tylenol as a painkiller. He talks about caffeine and some of these things. And he goes through a list of things that effectively the research says, from my understanding, they shut off triggers in your brain that tell you to slow down. We're trying to flip off as many switches as we can so we don't have to slow down. And I think that Alex Hutchinson makes a good point when he says it's not so amazing that every once in a while in an endurance event like a marathon somebody dies. It's amazing that it doesn't happen more often. And I think I want some of those switches. If my body's on the edge of, going to die, I want my brain to say slow down. And so I think instead of training, instead of taking things that shut off those switches, I've preferred to the approach of just training and learning to manage and listen to those. And frankly, a switch that says you're in trouble at mile 18 in a marathon might be a good one to hear before it comes smashing into your brain at mile 21. Maybe I can make an adjustment at mile 18 instead of crash at
Okay.
mile 21. And so I want
Right.
the feedback. And so for that reason, I don't take caffeine. I grew up not drinking anything that had caffeine in it. And so I've never experimented with caffeine. And I don't do the painkillers and stuff. I started drinking this stuff called Creo Brew that's like coffee for Mormons. It's chocolate. It's cocoa beans instead of coffee beans, and that has theobromine in it, which is a milder version of caffeine. And so I'm drinking that the morning of the race and figuring maybe that's a happy medium there. I've done stuff with beets. I don't know. I think it gets a little crazy when you're just putting powders in your drink. It's kind of funny to come out of drug testing after some of these races. We're in drug testing with everybody, and then someone walks out and they're holding their sample and it's blood red. And I think, oh, they were beet nitrate loading before the race, and so we are seeing that. But I don't know. I think while I can empathize or sympathize with the science that's there, I think a lot of times I just put more weight into what's worked for me without experimenting with too many of the current fads.
So that was a really interesting answer, I think, because right in the middle of it, I was going to ask you, but have you ever reached the 20-mile mark when you weren't getting signals that said, oh, shit, this doesn't feel so good? And wouldn't you like to have some of those signals shut off? But you gave a really reasonable answer to it. And that's the way you control the fatigue later in the race. I mean, you're going to feel, you're not going to break the tape or finish third or whatever. Having said this is as easy as a 2-mile jog around the block, it's going to hurt. What do you tell yourself when it hurts?
Well, I process it. I say, well, what is this hurt? Am I in a nutritional deficit? Do I need to get more calories in me? Is it just that, I try to take apart what is it that's causing this a little bit, because maybe running downhill faster feels all right, and so I can then focus on just get up the uphill because the downhill is going to feel good. Or if I think, I do kind of feel just like I don't have a lot of energy, maybe I need to try to get a little more sugar in me on my next fluid station. So I take it, but then and try to make a plan and then focus on where I'm at. I think Ryan Hall wrote a book that he titled Run the Mile You're In, and I think that is a powerful mantra for keeping your mind in the part of the battle that you're in. I don't know. There's scientists on all sides of the spectrum that will talk about why we hit a wall in a marathon. The nutritionists will talk about it, and the physiologists have a reason for why we hit a wall, and even the sports psychologists have a reason for it's a block of time that your brain can handle focusing on one thing or whatever. But I think what happens is there's a mental lapse where at some point in the race, call it mile 16 or 18, where we say, oh no, there's 10 miles left and I actually don't feel very good. When if the finish line of the race was at mile 19, there'd be no wall at mile 18. We'd be kicking. And so I think it becomes a trick of taking the information, adjusting for the rest of the race, but then coming back to the present and saying, okay, but what am I going to do right now?
Jared, I think World Athletics should quit worrying about regulations on shoes, and they should give all marathoners an IQ test so that the low guys like me won't have to compete with the smart guys. It's not a level playing field.
What's interesting about what Jared's several riffs here is a couple things. One is certainly this ability to use physiological signals and sort of manage your suffering is a common feature of elites, and the better people are, the better they do it. Bill Morgan showed that back in the 1970s and 80s, that elites associate, non-elites dissociate. They sing a song or think about building a house or going to the beach. And I think then the other thing, to get back to the ergogenic aids, is all those things have been shown to work in a lab test, not during the excitement and the psychological charge you have during a race. And so while there's good evidence for a number of them, you always have to remember that it's a lab-contrived environment and not real competition after a period of tapering and so forth, where you've been building for months or even in your case years for something. I would add one thing about the beetroot juice or the nitrates. is those can clearly be ergogenic in people with hypertension, heart failure, people who aren't very fit. My lab's just finished a very large meta-analysis of all the papers out there. And once you start talking about reasonably fit or very fit people, it's very difficult to find an effect size. Very, very difficult to find an effect size. So I think people, if they're making their urine red, it's expensive red urine.
So Jared, one part of marathon running that you really are an expert and a statistical expert on is marathon pacing, because you wrote your master's thesis or something on that, and you show it in all your races. You seem to have things dialed in. First, and I think the answer is pretty simple, what is the way to pace a marathon? And second, what do you do when you're in Atlanta and the race is not like Chicago, and it's going to be like this the whole way? Then how do you pace or apportion your effort?
Well, even before I ran my first marathon, Coach Eyestone would say halfway is 20 miles. And I think that became probably good for me mentally, but also good in terms of feeling like, maybe at 10 miles and at 12 and at 15, I still feel good, but we're not halfway yet. And I think sometimes we can get tempted in the middle of a marathon to think, hey, we're halfway through at 13.1 and we're feeling pretty good. And it's a long ways still yet to the finish line. And so I think patience is a big thing. This course is tough. I'm a stats guy, and there's just no data on this course. Okay, we have elevation profiles, and we can try to see what that translates to in terms of a New York or in terms of a Boston course. Certainly not like a flat Chicago course, and try to draw something from it. But I think that this marathon is a 28-mile marathon in terms of wear and tear on one's body, because we're going to be shifting from systems that are going to be working hard on the uphill to additional eccentric pounding on the downhill. And I think even though the race might only be 3 minutes longer, the wear and tear on your body might be much more than that. And so I think it's a race where it becomes particularly important to just wait.
Jared, will you use a heart rate monitor during the race?
I won't, no. Just by feel.
You're my hero.
If I recall right, you do like downhill running. Will you let yourself go a little on the downhills?
Yeah, well, we'll see. It'll kind of depend on how my legs feel towards the end of the race. Certainly don't aim to do anything too crazy early in the race, barring some shot of adrenaline or a piece of information that tells me that I should. But yeah, I don't want too much feedback. If I look down at my wrist at 15 miles and it says my heart rate's 182, I'm going to start sweating, and I don't want that. I just want to feel it, and yeah.
So we're going to finish up. This has been a fantastic discussion. I'm so happy these two have been with me. I got Jared here by promising him that we would respect, all of us would respect, the fact that he's got a marathon in less than 48 hours, whatever it is. So if you will not hound him for selfies and handshakes and all of that, his coach or manager is over here somewhere, and I'm hoping Bob will lead you to a nice quiet place. We're all wishing that you'll have a fantastic race on Saturday for sure. Michael and Jared both are here because they wanted to be here. Jared's got no sponsor or association or anyone who asked him to come. Michael paid his own way to come down here and be part of this small gathering. So please give them your thanks for what they contributed today. Thank you very much. And if you're cheering, cheer hard. And if you're racing on Sunday, race strong and hard. Thanks. Have a great weekend.